At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
Dès ma première rencontre avec M. Nehru, Delhi et à Chandigarh,
how from being a totally dusty plain, Chandigarh is now covered with greenery.
City must grow. It must be given a direction.
Hello and welcome to the story of Chandigarh, a podcast about how the modernist city of Chandigarh came into being and what its future might look like. This is Ishan Shafla, and with me is Dr. Vikramaditya Prakash. In this episode, we will talk about the implications of the UNESCO Heritage Tag for Chandigarh and its capital complex. We discuss the siting of the capital and its connection to cubism and the cosmos. We also talk about the open-ended quality of the capital complex and how it relates to the future of India's democracy. So why don't we begin by talking about the capital complex in the context of its recent designation of a UNESCO heritage site? How do you think it changed the perception of the capital complex and its position within the city and also within the wider architectural community?
Yeah, I think, of course, it's a great triumph to have the capital complex. And I think the museum also is part of it. Is it
Right.
all the Corbusier buildings in Chandigarh to be part of the UNESCO World Heritage? And as you know, they were entered into the UNESCO registers as a part of the Le Corbusier oeuvre, the entire Le Corbusier work. So it wasn't really Chandigarh that was entered into UNESCO World Heritage. It was Le Corbusier who was entered into UNESCO World Heritage. And as part of that, they entered these Chandigarh buildings as well.
So when you hear about, architects and people from Chandigarh, pushing for the capital complex to be included in UNESCO, was that just a coincidence that ended up happening at that time, or would have happened anyway, you think?
Well, there was a debate going on before that, whether Chandigarh itself should be entered into UNESCO Heritage, or all of Chandigarh, or Corbusier's Chandigarh and Jeanneret's Chandigarh, and the rest of the city should be entered into Heritage. And there was a big push, I think even by Docomomo, I think International, or even UNESCO, to try and enter Chandigarh into UNESCO World Heritage. The same as Brasilia. Oscar Niemeyer and Lucio Costa's Brasilia as a city, the complete city has been entered into UNESCO World Heritage. And the idea was that Chandigarh should also be entered into World Heritage in the same way. But from what I remember, basically Chandigarh administration and a lot of Chandigarh people opposed it, because I think they were really worried that World Heritage would throttle the economic growth of the city and throttle the prices. And at that time, there was all this movement to make multi-story buildings in the larger plots of Chandigarh, and even to sell stories, build houses story-wise, etc. So there was a lot of pushback on entering Chandigarh into World Heritage from Chandigarh. And so I think that's the only reason why Chandigarh itself was not entered into World Heritage. Only the Capitol buildings were entered into World Heritage. Only the Corbusier buildings were entered into World Heritage.
Yeah, it's sort of seen as a double-edged sword, isn't it? That you get the UNESCO tag, you get things preserved, but at the same time, there's maybe an element of things being frozen in time and not allowed to move forward.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. UNESCO Heritage does freeze things in time. It comes with funding and resources, but it does freeze things in time. But I think, I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on preservation, but although my new book is on preservation as future modernism. So yeah, I think there is a provision in UNESCO Heritage for not only preservation and tourism, but also sort of for contemporary adaptation and development. I'm not exactly sure. But fundamentally, its force is to make sure that nothing crazy and untoward happens to the buildings. So in that sense, it's really good because, before UNESCO Heritage, the buildings were deteriorating. They were sort of modifying that willy-nilly, all the buildings in various ways. At one point, they had put in plywood paneling all over in the interior of the assembly building. They at one point taken down the tapestries from the High Court, and sort of who knows what is going to happen to them. There's all that addition of air conditioning and glazing in the Secretariat. So, and then they had the barbed wire across the middle of the plaza for security reasons and so on, right? So it was a really unfriendly and unappreciated place. So in that sense, it's good that UNESCO Heritage came in.
I mean, regardless, in terms of access, I don't think it has changed a lot of things, right? I mean, it's still barbed wire around the capital.
Right, that's true. So security has been maintained, but now at least the buildings are reasonably well maintained, and now there's a visitor center that was added to the Capitol complex. And now there are guided tours at certain times, to the Capitol buildings.
Yeah.
So at least that is there. Before that, even that was so difficult. You had to find permission to be able to go there. So it was quite a problem.
It makes me wonder if the UNESCO tag, if it was applied to the whole city, if that would have affected, the trade of the furniture, or how that played out.
That's a really good question. Regardless of the, maybe. Because then the whole furniture should also be protected with it.
Yeah, or at least what remains is restored and put in its right place.
Right.
Whatever remains. Yeah.
I mean, it's a good point that they don't have genre on UNESCO World Heritage. And, this is part of the European class system, I suppose. Corbusier is the real deal. Genre is always his poor cousin. Yeah, all that is genre. So that's why it's not protected. And certainly not the Indian architects. The Indian architects, which should be protected. Or at least there should be some kind of a discourse on the Indian architects. It's certainly missing. So there's this hierarchy, Corbusier, yes, genre second, Maxwell Fry, Jane Roux sort of remembered. A lot of people don't even know probably who they are. And then the Indian architects, are kind of semi-erased from the memory of the city.
But even in terms of Corbusier's own work, it seems they left out significant bits like the College of Art and the Lake Club, and they kept all the monumental works as part of the list.
College of Art and Lake Club is not included?
Not sure. Is it?
Sure it is.
Okay.
There should be. I mean, it's worth finding out.
Mm.
But College of Architecture is not included. That's the important thing to note. Because College of Architecture designed by Aditya Prakash technically.
Right.
Although it's an adaptation and scaling of the School of Art.
Yeah. I mean, there is an embedded Eurocentrism in how these buildings are selected, isn't it?
Yeah, Eurocentrism, or there is this question of authorship and Eurocentrism in there, where, the translation of School of Art into College of Architecture, which is an interesting story in itself, which we should discuss sometime. What is its status? The same question also applies to Shivdat Sharma's adaptation of the Heidi Weber House, into what is now the Chandigarh Museum. Yeah. I mean, the Heidi Weber House is in metal and designed by Corbusier, and that's 100% World Heritage. But Corbusier never detailed or built what was called the temporary exhibits pavilion next to the museum. So Shivdat Sharma kind of did his interpretation and adaptation of it. And I'm sure that is not included in World Heritage. So there are these two buildings at least that are sort of readings of Corbusier work. But they are, quote unquote, unfaithful, or I would say translated or interpreted or transformed readings of the work.
Right, secondary.
Yeah, but I try and argue that all readings are interpretation and translations and transformations. There's no such thing as an original. So, but anyway, we'll get into all this later, but all this to say that the Capitol complex is entered into World Heritage as part of Corbusier's oeuvre. And in one sense, it makes sense because, you can argue that the Capitol complex is Le Corbusier's greatest work. Because it's certainly his largest work, major buildings, 3, major buildings with monuments and a layout, all done right next to each other as part of a larger scheme. He doesn't have that anywhere else in the world. He has a bunch of houses and unités and a pavilion Suisse, etc. in Paris. Even Paris doesn't have kind of a concentrated monumental, grand, mature manifestation of the Corbusian oeuvre, like Chandigarh does, and certainly the capital complex does.
Right.
So we should bring in Maristella Casciato in perhaps our next episode, who has just published the album Punjab, the album in which Corbusier documented all his thinking first time he came to India. But there is certainly the sense that when Corbusier designed the capital complex from roughly 1952 to, he was designing it to the end in 1965. So from when he was 65 to like 77, 78 years old till his death. This was his obsession at the very end as the summation of his thinking.
So he was at the peak of his powers.
He was at the peak of his powers, one could say. I mean, the amazing thing about Corbusier is you look at his work, he was at the peak of his powers from day one. I mean, this was the amazing thing about the man. You look at his earliest houses, you look at Villa Savoie, everything. I was just at the Maison La Roche, where the Fondation Le Corbusier is in Paris. I mean, what a masterpiece of, art. The way it moves around, the way spaces are constructed, the interrelation of space. It looks very simple and dumb, but, it's a masterful work. So he was, as a spatial thinker, as a sort of articulator of form, space, light, circulation, he was a genius all throughout. And in Chandigarh, particularly in the capital complex, that work kind of took on grand proportions. You look at the sort of movement and rationalizations of his projects through the years, they just manifested at full size, full expression in Chandigarh, which is completely paradoxical because in Chandigarh, he had no budget. All these buildings compared to his other buildings are cheaply made and hand poured and, low technology and slowly built, and all kinds of mistakes were made in the process. But this was also the amazing thing about his work in Chandigarh. He just rolled with the punches and kept developing it. And he screamed at Jeanneret. He complained to Nehru. He screamed at the engineers. He was always upset. But nevertheless, he kept accepting the limitations of the situation and kept designing.
So he adapted very well to the
situation. He accepted and built it. But what I'm trying to say is he never, in spite of the situation, he never compromised on the idea that this should be his grand projet. Like this is his biggest, best work that he can do. So in that sense, it was what's the Sanskrit term? In English, the poor way we say is labor of love, but it was a dharma jo hota hai na. He was fulfilling his dharma in doing this work. He wasn't doing it for money or khyati or fame or anything like that, particularly in the making of the capital complex. So he wanted all of Chandigarh to be that, but he was disappointed by the rest of the city.
Or he felt like this was his little, playground where he's completely in control. Is that why there was the artificial hill was so important to the capital?
Yeah, you're right. He did sort of build the artificial hills, and he built all those mounds towards the city, because he did want to sort of separate the capital complex from the rest of the city. Right.
Both visually and metaphorically, like
visually, metaphorically,
about
spatially, and then you can say maybe he wanted to make a playground on the other side. And I have written otherwise that he wanted to create an empty canvas for himself. But now that I've spent a lot more time thinking about it again in my new book, I have come to the conclusion that he conceived it as a dharmashetra, as a place where he had to do tapasya and really focus on the work. So I think of him more as clearing the ground and setting the parameters and dimensions and boundaries where he was going to do his dharmic dhyan. He was going to establish dhyan.
Isn't that literally how the buildings were sited, though? There was people with poles, and Corbusier was sort of choreographing where they stand and how far apart, and making sketches at the same time.
Yes. So that's the story of how the story. So even in the earlier sketches, you see Corbusier sort of took the area that he was doing and he designated the site. Since the site was open and huge, he said, what are the boundaries of my site? And he wasn't going to make boundary walls or anything, but he wanted to outline the site, and he outlined it by describing 2 squares of 800 meters each. And he said that the buildings are to be located inside these squares. But these squares, so it was in that sense a double square plan.
Yeah.
Right? 2 squares plans. Like, for instance, if you take the temple in Tanjore, the Thanjavur, the Rajarajeshwar's Brihadeshwara temple in Thanjavur, that's also a perfect double square. And that is a double square in which everything aligns perfectly, and the shivling falls at the center of one of the squares. So, listeners can't see that, but they can look it up. But in Chandigarh, the double square is sort of a general description of site, not a geometric system by which all the buildings are located precisely. They are located precisely, as you are saying, by visual parameters. I remember I once was showing my father this plan, this double squares of Chandigarh. And he said, no, he didn't use any of these double squares. He told me the story that people were used to be sent to site and they'd hold up these survey rolls, He would have them stand on site and where the buildings were supposed to be. And then he would sketch in the buildings against the Himalayas. And he therefore placed them visually from site. Like he would have people move and then he would sketch them again. And there's this famous sketch of Corbusier's where he finally has the buildings exactly where he wants them. And underneath he's written sur place exact, on place exact. So this was the thing about Corbusier, is that on the one hand, he designed from the human eye level, right? Which is the level at which architecture is inhabited and consumed by the human eye or the human body moving in space. He designed for the moving human body, like how moving human body would gather architecture. But at the same time, he was also designing from the bird's eye, which was the big plan from the sky, right? So from the bird's eye view, from the sky looking down, and from the human level looking towards the horizon, that makes for a 90-degree angle. And reconciling those 2 angles, bird's eye view and human eye view, was the name of the game in the Corbusier's, which is the same technique that Picasso used in cubist painting.
Cézanne.
And Cézanne did also?
Yeah, people argue that Cézanne was the beginning, or has the seeds of cubism in Cézanne's work. Certain ways in which he drew still life. The orange sort of sits at the edge of the table in a way where it looks like you could be looking at it from top or the front. That sort of interplay between elevation and plan.
Interplay between elevation and plan, exactly. So interplay between elevation and plan, or between plan and section, and that sort of rotation of 90 degrees that was brought about by cubism as the refutation of perspective. This was all anti-perspectival thinking, where perspective is all about one point and sort of the grand view, and as in Renaissance buildings. Cubism was about the movement of the body in space. To see a Picasso sculpture, Picasso painting, it imagined movement through space. And Corbusier took that and tried to produce an architecture out of it. So it was a brilliant kind of way of working between elevation or the human eye level and plan, which is the bird's eye view.
Traditionally, you tend to think of these buildings as having the Himalayas as the backdrop, but then you also have him sketching from behind, from Kansal, these initial, the Punjab album. There's a lot of sketches from that vantage point. So he's kind of poking at it from all different angles.
Yeah. So initially, when he was first in Chandigarh, Corbusier imagined the Capitol complex as well integrated into the city. He saw the Capitol complex and then these series of buildings going down Janmarg as sort of continuations of the Capitol's buildings. And the Sector 17 was supposed to have tall buildings also. The idea was that all this would be part of one integrated complex. But he also wanted to build some unités in Chandigarh and make tall towers there. But all that was shut down, disallowed. And when he sort of felt that the city had gone out of his hand and out of his control, then he focused only on the capital, built the artificial hills, and later on never sketched the capital complex back again from the Council side. He always sketched looking towards Council and towards the mountain. So one very important thing is that, so instead of the capital complex being the head of the city with the artificial hills, Corbusier made the capital complex a part of the surrounding agro-rural landscape. The land around the capital complex, at that time, there were still villages. Kansal was preserved, and Kundali Sher further to the west. And the agricultural fields to the north were still functional. So what have all become farmhouses now. But at that time, they were sort of functioning agricultural fields. And he saw his buildings as part of that agro-rural.
In your first book on Chandigarh, I read, I think we mentioned this before as well, that he thought of the village residents from the neighboring villages as the idealized inhabitants of the capital.
Yes, that's right. That's what that in a sense is what I'm trying to say here, is that for Corbusier, he was building not just an administrative buildings for the state of Punjab, he was also building an architecture for modern India. And India, for him, like Gandhiji used to say, lives in its villages. And the point there for Corbusier was that the agro-rural landscape, it was a beautiful landscape and a landscape that shouldn't be destroyed and replaced with urbanism, but that his buildings should integrate into that landscape. It's a very counterintuitive reading because we always think of Corbusier as the city man, right? He can, Villa Contemporary, city of 3 million and radiant city in 1920s, 30s, erase Paris and replace it with skyscrapers and so on. We think of him as the man who championed extreme urbanism, like the grandfather of Super Studio, right? But actually, Corbusier's vision was, at least by the time he reached Chandigarh, but you also see this, and there may be a little bit of Orientalism in this, but you also see this in his plan for Algiers, that he imagined that his buildings raised on pillar T, disconnected from the ground, would kind of be these achievements of modern technology that, in a sense, floated over the existing agro-rural landscape and harmonized with it in a kind of a romantic, pastoral, Rousseau-esque vision of modernity.
They don't impose themselves on the landscape, rather they emerge from it.
Well, not emerge, they sort of co-inhabit. So it's a romantic image, but that was the thinking. And that's why we were talking in the last episode of the Secretariat going all the way down the Leisure Valley. It is part of that same vision. Like often enough, people publish pictures, of people in bicycles heading to the Corbusier buildings, when they were being constructed, or rickshaws standing there, or bulls and cows, etc. And they say, oh, contradiction, right? For Corbusier, this was not a contradiction. This was the purpose of what he wanted to do. He was so enchanted the first time he came to India. He just so loved the villages. He went to Bombay, he went to Delhi. There is nothing in his sketchbooks on those cities, but there is sketch upon sketch on the animals in the villages and the housing in the villages and the forms of the mud houses, and in his writing just glories of the village, which is a funny thing because Meyer was trying to design ideal villages for Gandhiji. But of course, Corbusier pushed Meyer off the project. So in that sense, one probably thinks that, Corbusier and Nehru's visions for Chandigarh were probably at odds. Nehruji wanted a modernist city, future-looking, how India is going to build in the future. Whereas Corbusier secretly was thinking, well, we've got to, maintain the rural landscape. But it was romantic. What were you saying?
I was going to say it's difficult to aesthetically categorize them. I mean, in a good way. They have this alien or like otherness to them. When you enter the Capitol complex, there's this feeling of, entering a world into itself. And they're monumental, but despite being such buildings of monumental scale, they don't make you feel diminished, There's a sense of perfection in the composition.
Yeah. I mean, do they make you feel diminished? I think they are monumental buildings. And I think
not in the Albert Speer sense, monumental, in a democratizing sense.
Yeah, I mean, but their purpose is they're like temples, huge temple. We are talking about Tanjore, I don't know if you've been to Tanjore. Have you been to Tanjore, to Thanjavur?
No, not yet.
Oh, you have to go. Raja Rajeshwar, 1000 AD, 1,000 years ago, building a huge temple, like it's like a 30-story building. It's like 300, 400 feet tall building in 1000 AD. So why did they make huge, big temples? And I think the idea was that it depends on how you look at it. In the Old Testament, they made, in Abrahamic civilization, they tried to make the Tower of Babel, and supposedly God or Yahweh struck it down because it was too egotistical, that human beings trying to touch the sky. So in Western Abrahamic civilization, there is a sort of a censure against over monumentality as egotism. Okay.
Right.
But see, when you look at the Hindu temples are meant to be representations of the entire cosmos, of the entire firmament, from the North Star to all the other stars which revolve around the North Star, to the planets, to the ground, to the ocean that surrounds the ground, to the underground, and everything. They're supposed to be representation of the entire cosmos, and the entire cosmos, we're talking pre-modern astronomy, obviously, before we knew that, the earth is a ball, etc., etc. Yeah. And it goes around the sun. We're talking about pre-modern astronomy. Temples were supposed to be representation of that largeness of the universe. So their largeness was meant to produce a sense of awe, adbhuti in Sanskrit, sense of awe for the universe. And I think Corbusier's buildings were intended to also generate that sense of awe for the universe. And I read them as buildings dedicated to the cosmos. Of course, they are functional at one level, right? I mean, it's their secretariat and courts and assembly chambers and so on and so forth. But they are at their essence, in one sense, dedicated to the cosmos. So you look at the assembly building. What is at the top of the assembly tower? What is the thing at the top?
The paraboloid.
The hyperbolic paraboloid main.
Yeah.
At the top is what? There are solar symbols. There is the movement of the sun in the summer, movement of the sun in the winter, and there is the curve taken from Jantar Mantar represented at the top. Why are all those symbols put at the top?
I mean, not just there, it's throughout the capital, in the casts in the concrete and on the enamel door of the assembly.
Yes, everywhere there is reference to the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planetary cosmic events within which the building is placed. Now, you can take this at a very utilitarian level and say, well, Corbusier designed buildings to, keep the summer sun out and let the winter sun in, and to let the sun, protect them from leaking. One can say very utilitarian things like that. And then one can say, well, he added poetics into that, and who knows what poetics means. And Corbusier sort of promoted this kind of thinking also, because he said, it's about poetics, and you make me move. You move me as, vague, sort of, Plato kind of things over there. But the way I read it is that these buildings, particularly the assembly, but also the unbuilt governor's palace, were clearly intended to address the celestial realm in the same way that temples address this celestial. Well, all sacred buildings, in a sense, represent the celestial realms. A church also, represents the, what do you call it? The dome of heaven, and then the cube of earth, which is kind of, in one sense, significantly more ordinary as compared to a Hindu temple in its conception. But Corbusier is taking that idea of celestiality and bringing it to modern times.
That definitely, the backdrop of the Himalayas seems to heighten that sense of, cosmic landscape.
Yeah, for sure.
But at the same
it's a
time,
good
there's
question.
there's a layering of, meaning, because there's the obvious confrontation, like you said, the utilitarian buildings is a confrontation of the legislature and the judiciary, and there's a crack in the middle, which is the path that goes to the open hand, and in the middle of that composition is the pit of contemplation beneath the open hand.
That's right. Yeah, there is so much going on, so much going on. It's such a rich tapestry that the buildings themselves are celestial objects, but the Himalayas on one side and the artificial hills on the other side, they all come together to make like an enclosure for the capital, right? That they kind of make a huge big bowl within which the buildings sit. But it's such a big bowl that it's not really an enclosure. It's an enclosure at some distance. And then within these are placed these sets of buildings which don't create an enclosure in the classic postmodern or Western sense, or even the Fatehpur Sikri sense. They don't make courtyards, right?
Yeah.
There was this some architect from Canada once in the 70s. He tried to add buildings into the Capitol complex so that it would make a piazza, like St. Mark's in Venice, or Diwane Khas in Fatehpur Sikri, or Jama Masjid in kind of the thinking that the transformation, for instance, of Sept also, which was being done, to make defined space. But the thing about the Capitol buildings is that they have their sense, their enclosure is cosmic, which is to say at the level of the Himalayas. And they intend to produce a space between the Capitol buildings that is not a space of gathering like in a European piazza, where people sit around a table or in cafes or in groups and confer, but rather is a space for the philosophers who walk in Corbusier's imagination from the place of justice to the place of legislature, and keeping in mind the celestial realms, the planet, if they want to keep in mind God, and think about what the laws and justice should be in these conditions of life.
The way you describe it almost sounds a bit like Corbusier was a set designer. This is a stage for him.
To a certain extent, he contributed he believed in the ideal of the philosopher king, the sort of Plato's idea of a philosopher king. And in some ways, I think he was most impressed by P.L. Verma. P.L. Verma was a big supporter of Corbusier's, and he was the engineer. And he was a damn good engineer. I mean, he knew his math, he knew how to build things. But Corbusier would often make notes that P.L. Verma is this amazing man who is an engineer and scientist who prays. He was like, why is he praying? So I think to a certain extent in his imagination, the ideal person was a P.L. Verma. And all the legislators and justices were versions of Jawaharlal Nehru as philosopher's king. Because Nehru was a classic philosopher king, right? Because Nehru was a philosopher. He read philosophy, he wrote philosophy, he wrote history, he tried to understand life in an intellectual way, and he tried to translate that into legislation, into the vision of a nation. Corbusier thought that these villagers would, in a sense, grow up and become Nehrus. And he imagined that the legislators and judges were those kind of people. He didn't think of them as wannabe British babus.
Do you think because Corbusier was, Swiss French, is that the usual basis of why the discussion around the capital complex usually focuses on, the east-west dichotomy, whether they're Indian or, suitable for the Indian context. Did Corbusier did a good job at aesthetically, absorbing and, absorbing his Indian experience into something apt.
Yeah, so this is always a big question. I think it's a sort of a postmodern question. And it was started by Louis Mumford and Jane Jacobs and this whole crowd. In particular, I think because, Albert Meyer and Nowicki got shoved off the project. Louis Mumford was a big supporter of Albert Meyer. And in fact, he was a consultant on Albert Meyer's project. So Louis Mumford hated Corbusier from day one, from well before Chandigarh. And so they were part of the process. And then with postmodernism in the 70s, Chandigarh started to flip from being the shining example of the aspirations and visions of modern India. Until then, Chandigarh used to be held up as, look what India has done. And it became, white Western man coming over and taking over. Of course, this conversation was older. The arts and crafts movement in India, for instance, the J.L. Kipling and Ruskin and so on, who were in India in the late 19th century, were already talking about preserving Indian crafts because they wanted to keep India Indian.
So sort of
But
rescuing, yeah.
Rescue. It's a rescue project. Yeah.
Like saving India from India.
Yeah, saving India from becoming too quote unquote Western and modern. Because of course, modernity is their thing, like modernity cannot belong to the rest of the world. Like they have to be their own thing. Nehruji never bought any of this. He said, this is nonsense. Modernity and modernism belongs to us as much as anybody else, and we are just going to do it. So, and Corbusier never thought of, making his buildings Indian, like Herbert Baker and Lutyens were forced to do. They were made to put elephants on the buildings and Indian decorations on basically stripped Western neoclassicism. Corbusier thought of his architecture as human architecture, as architecture that arose out of generalized conditions of living on planet Earth. And for him, the conditions of India were, in a sense, ideal conditions because he was disillusioned by where modern West was going. And he was particularly compared Chandigarh all the time with United Nations because he had just been working on the United Nations building after World War II in New York, where he was part of a team of, international team of, I don't remember, it was 12 or 15 architects. And basically he quarreled with them and they quarreled with him and he was pushed off the project, although his design was quote unquote, adopted for the UN building. Basically, they took his design and adopted it, Alicia Costa, Matthew Nowicki was part of that team and all these people. Mm-hmm. They adopted it. And Corbusier also didn't want the building to be located in New York, in Manhattan, in the middle of all that urbanism. He wanted it to be in California, surrounded by open green land. So he was opposed to it in many ways. So he came to Chandigarh and he wanted Chandigarh to be the answer to the United Nations. He says, this is how you build a civilization that's in harmony with the planet and not the way the UN is made and how it is conceived.
What happened in the 70s? You say there's a change in perception.
Yeah, well, the change in perception basically was that, at least in the West, Corbusier became the demigod, that the guy who was, particularly in America, as the person who was responsible for destroying American cities. So in America, the highways were run through the middle of cities. And then a lot of neighborhoods were destroyed and leveled to build huge, big housing projects. And these were considered to have destroyed the cities. And kind of a movement was organized around these by people, in particular people like Jane Jacobs. And although Corbusier had not built any towers or any housing in America, he was blamed for all the urban renewal, as it was called. And modernism became a bad word, with Corbusier as the baddest of the modernists.
Because he's the face of modernism.
The face of modernism, the greatest architect of the 20th century. often say. And in that fold, because Corbusier was the bad guy, Chandigarh was his biggest project. And even though none of these people had actually really been to Chandigarh, Chandigarh was folded into being an example of bad city building. So with the rise of postmodernism, with the destruction of Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, and the writing of books like The Language of Postmodern Architecture by Charles Jenks, Chandigarh got roped into that thing as failures. Now, this was accompanied by the fact that the Nehruvian modernist project in India was also faltering in the 70s. All right. In the 50s, India was full of optimism. In the 60s, the Nehruvian modernism ran into trouble. We had famine in the early 60s. And the sort of the promises that Nehru's worldview had made of, bringing industrialization and modernization, that never really, that didn't succeed as fast and as well as he hoped it would. And by the early 70s, with the shock of the oil prices, there was a huge sort of spurt in oil prices. There was an energy crisis in the 1970s, and inflation went into 15-20%. And unemployment in India rose into very high levels. And corruption became endemic everywhere to do anything. Everything was controlled by government of India, and everything was corrupt. So to advance at all anywhere, you had to be corrupt. And if you had any ability, you just wanted to get out of India and go to America. So in that context, the Nehruvian state, the Nehruvian vision also came under attack in India. And so with that, the Nehruvian things also came under attack, such as modernism. So there was a double confluence in the 70s. From the West, Corbusier and modernism was blamed for the sort of destroying the American city, and in India, the perceived failures of the Nehruvian nation state both came together to create a situation in the 70s, which there was a lot of student unrest. Hold on. So the classic film of the 1970s is Diwar. Have you seen Diwar with Amitabh Bachchan and Shashi Kapoor?
Raj Kapoor?
No.
Achha,
Not Raj Kapoor.
Yes.
This is the one in which Shashi Kapoor is the honest police officer and Amitabh Bachchan becomes a smuggler. And their father is compromised because he's a union leader, but the mill owners sort of force him to renege. So the whole family ends up on a footpath. And the argument basically is that if you want to become rich, you have to be corrupt. It's the idea that you have to choose. You can be the poor and moral and upright, but if you want to be successful, then you have to compromise your values. And so it comes up with the image of the angry young man. Amitabh Bachchan embodied it.
And this is in the time of the emergency also, right? Around
And
that time.
it leads to the emergency. It leads, Diwar is right almost the same time as the emergency and the height of architectural postmodernism.
And the open hand, funnily, also came up around the same time, isn't that right?
Open hand came up in the early 80s. Yeah, that's a separate story. But yeah, it's sort of there. By the 80s, everything had started to unravel. And Punjab was in terrorism. Sort of by the 80s, the currents had shifted irreversibly in a new direction, which would lead to Babri Masjid and the rise of BJP and neoliberalism. But the crisis that was unleashed in the 70s, finally Narasimha Rao sort of diffused it in the early 90s by liberalizing India's economy and completely opening it up and making it part of the global economic order, which is the India of today.
I mean, that was part of a global wave, wasn't it, with Thatcher and
yes, that was in the 80s. But let's not go there. Let's stay still with we are staying in the 50s and the 60s. You're running ahead. I'm trying to in the 50s, Chandigarh was a romantic project. Nehruvian vision was big. And since you have brought up the open hand, the classic sort of motive of this kind of thinking was Nehru's vision for the non-aligned movement. Nehru in 1955, I think in the Bandung conference in Indonesia, along with Nasser, Abdul Jamal Nasser from Egypt and Joseph Broz Tito from Yugoslavia, and a whole host of additional, basically post-colonial countries, formed the non-aligned movement, which was to counter what was considered to be the two-world theory of the Cold War, right?
Right.
The Cold War was the communist world versus the capitalist world, or USSR versus United States of America. And the word that was being put out is that there are two worlds, the communist world and the capitalist world, and you have to pick which side you join. And Nehru and the non-aligned countries said, we refuse to pick, and we are going to be not aligned to either of those. And they formed what they considered to be the third world, all right? That's how the term third world came about. It was supposed to be an alternative to two-world thing, huh?
I didn't know that's where the phrase originated.
That's where the phrase third world comes from. In time, because it was only countries like India, Sri Lanka, Yugoslavia, Egypt, Brazil, most of Africa, all the post-colonial countries that joined the non-aligned movement, that joined the third world, that it became a symbol for the poor countries.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing over here is that when Nehru proclaimed the third world and the non-aligned movement, Corbusier was the first person amongst the architects to put up his hand and said, this is a great thing. And he offered Nehru the open hand as the symbol of the non-aligned. He said, here, this is my finest creation as a symbol. And why don't you adopt it as a symbol of the non-aligned? So Corbusier, thought of Chandigarh, and he of course gave the open hand as a symbol of Chandigarh, and he offered it as a symbol of the non-aligned, because he wanted to enjoin his project to these two ideas.
But if it was
I'm trying to explain the spirit of Chandigarh and Nehru and the international world at that time.
But if they were both on the same page about the open hand, at least, why did it take so long for that and the monuments in the Capitol complex to come up?
They had no money. Nehru had no money. All these monuments, etc., in the open hand were considered, add-ons. When we have a little bit of extra cash, we'll build them. And Nehru just said these are local decisions. It's got, I don't need them. He just sort of said, fine. Let's concentrate on the big things, basically.
And that brings up the question about the vast empty space in the Capitol. You've argued, I think, in your new book that it's intentionally left sort of half complete. What do you think Corbusier is thinking behind that?
Yeah, so that was what I was trying to hint at when I was talking about the Chandigarh's space between the big buildings is not enclosed like Piazza San Marco or like one of Fatehpur Sikri's great courtyard or like a Jama Masjid, because it is meant to be a space which leaks into the surrounding landscape and allows the surrounding landscape to leak into it. So it is not incomplete. It is more in the sense of open-ended or intermingled with the surrounding landscape. He's trying to exact a balance between a defined pathway, an architectural promenade, a place for walking between the High Court and the Secretariat, as a place where these philosophers, rulers, legislators and judges would walk across and have serious conversations about the meaning of law, justice, legislation, and its relationship to the animals and to the sky, and as a place where the surroundings would be gathered as a reminder of this larger cosmic reality. So it's a leaky space. I think the Italian authors who wrote the book on béton brut, on raw concrete, described it as being leaky, as open-ended. Now, I also read that a bit more interpretively as a space of democracy to come, right? Which is the idea that this kind of idealized citizenry that Corbusier imagined as inhabiting the promenade was not something that was predefined or prescribed by him, but was a kind of a citizenry that was yet to be cultivated and developed, which even he didn't know what its future was. And in that sense, it's also a place of anticipation and incompletion, whose exact outlines would have to be completed in a future to come.
I mean, that's still the case, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's still the case.
Still unfolding.
Still unfolding. Still unfolding. I mean, India is considered to be one of the paramount, paradigmatic examples of democracy in the world, but its future is still uncertain and open-ended. This was the thing, I think, the point that Sunil Khildani was making in in the conversation I had with him and Partha Mitter and Mark Jasenbeck and Tony Vidler, is that when we talk about, more recent governments in India as being more totalitarian, we can either see that as the decline of democracy in India, or we can see that as the testing of the democratic strength of India. A strong democratic system must anticipate and expect and be able to work its way through and learn from strong challenges too.
So it's a critique of the constitution, in a sense, or the strength of it to resist autocratic tendencies.
Yeah, we'll find out how strong the constitution is. And the ethos it inculcated, will the sort of modernist vision, to put it more locally, inhabited or put into the capital complex by romantics like Corbusier and Nehru, does it have the strength to withstand all the challenges to it and learn from them and mature and grow into a powerful vision? Or is it going to just wither and be forgotten and appropriated and destroyed? There is no guarantee.
That's a difficult question. Like, can architecture, contribute? I guess that was the project, contribute to the process of nation building and to the transformation of the nation state and the citizen.
Well, architecture contributes, unquestionably. Architecture is considered important. This is why the English built New Delhi. This is why the Mughals built the big cities. This is why, Raja Rajeshwar built Chola Temple. This is why the popes built St. Peter's. And this is why the Taliban, put their planes into the World Trade Center, because big architecture is expensive. A lot of people, it takes a lot to build massive buildings. And a lot has to be invested in, So it's not about just destroying an expensive building. It's about making a statement about what you are standing for or what you are standing against. You can say, the Taliban only succeeded in killing 1,500 people when they destroyed the Twin Towers, or it was like 1,500. If they had killed in 1,500 Americans, over time with bombs in the public squares, people would have been really upset, but not the way they were when the Twin Towers came down. So architecture, unquestionably, because of its resilience also, buildings stand for a long time, contribute to more abstract ideological conceptions, such as democracy and nation building, alongside, obviously, legislation, justice, economic policy, planning, and so on and so forth. And, police and all these other things. Everything contributes. Even poetry, music, film for sure contributes.
Because they're such old buildings, the Capitol complex, and we tend to visit it as sort of architectural, say, tourist. It's easy to forget, that they're living, functioning buildings. There's always tend to look at it as old buildings.
And that's the great danger, the great sadness of these buildings being entered into UNESCO as aesthetic masterpieces of a great Euro-modernist, Le Corbusier. They are not entered into the UNESCO registers as amazing achievements of the Nehruvian nation state and its aspirations, or the Indian nation state and its aspirations, as they should have been.
The way you say it should have been labeled, that pushes it into the present instead of way back into the past.
Yeah, well, my new book is continuing to ask what is the status of the Indian post-colonial project in the 21st century. There are a lot of people who think that project has failed and forgotten and should be dusted and buried. But I'm trying to ask, what is the status? So that the danger in the UNESCO World Heritage is that it sort of puts Chandigarh into the glorious past. There is Taj Mahal and then there is Chandigarh. It's good to have it for the past, but not relevant to the present. And I dispute that. And that's why the title of my book is Preservation as Future Modernism.
So preservation as an active process rather than...
Yeah, I say Chandigarh was meant to be, as Nehruji said, a symbol of the nation's faith in the future. So that concept is what needs to be preserved. Is it is a turn towards the future, not to make Chandigarh a vision of the past. That idea is to be preserved. And that idea is preserved by continuing to make Chandigarh about the future.
Thanks for listening to the story of Chandigarh. This is your host and producer, Ishan Chofla. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you can email us at storyofchandigarh@gmail.com. We'll continue our conversation in the next episode. Until then, this is the story of Chandigarh.